See. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another live stream here for the Hickory Street Church of Christ. And just to remind you, we are on Zoom now. So if you would like to participate in the discussion, I'm going to be unmuting everybody from time to time as we go through some of these passages. So you'll have the opportunity to ask questions, to give your feedback, and make comments or whatever it is that you want to do besides preach a sermon. I do have the capability of muting you, so the amount of time you have to respond is limited. Not really, but if you want to come and participate, just email me at danielcr2011@gmail.com, and I will send you the link to join our Zoom chat. I've already emailed a couple of people who said that they wanted to hop in and join us, and so we should be hearing from them. If not tonight, maybe starting Sunday. Today we're going to be in James chapter 5. Last week at Wednesday night Bible study, we already finished up all the way through James chapter 4 and verse 17. And tonight we're going to look at James chapter 5 and verses 1 through 6. And what James 5, 1 through 6 is all about is, as my Bible captions here for us, is the misuse of riches. The misuse of riches. The importance of this passage is that it continues the discussion that begun in the very first chapter. If you go back to James chapter 1, you'll see that. In James chapter 1 and verse 4 here, he tells them, "Let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Though they may lack in physical riches, they would not lack in heavenly riches." And as you go on in this passage, you might read in verse 9 about the brother of humble circumstances. He is to glory in his high position, and the rich man is to glory in his humiliation, because like flowering grass, he will pass away. So there are several references in James chapter 1 to this rich man versus the poor man. In James chapter 2 as well, and there's other things in James 1 that go over this, but in James chapter 2 as well, we have this discussion continued. For in verse 2 and 3, we read this: "If a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to the one who is wearing the fine clothes, and say, 'You sit here in a good place,' and you say to the poor man, 'You stand over there, or sit down by my footstool,' have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives?" He goes on to say in verse 5, "Listen, my beloved brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into court? Do they not blaspheme the fair name by which you have been called?" So James chapter 1 and James chapter 2 both focus on this contention between the rich and the poor. In the book of James chapter 3, we have a similar thing here. Let's see. In James chapter 3 and verse 16, we have a similar thing where he says, "For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing." And so in this passage as well, we have a reference to this rich-poor issue in the first century church to whom James was writing. It exists all over the place in his epistles. When we come into chapter 4, we see the same thing. There were those who were waging war based upon their pleasures, as you see in verse 1. You go on down to verse 9 and 10, he says this: "Be miserable and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning, your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the presence of the Lord, and he will exalt you." And then finally, in verse 13 through 17, we have a short passage here about how to properly use one's riches. And he says that there's these men, and they say to themselves, "We're going to go and spend a year in another city and engage in business and make a profit," in James 4 and verse 13. And what James condemns them for is not including God in their plans, as we see in verse 15. And he finishes that by saying, "Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin." And so then in James chapter 5, following this short passage in James 4:13 through 17, we have a lengthy discussion here in chapter 5 about what happens to those in the first century that were misusing their riches. And we're going to see that the way that they were misusing their riches was by not paying the laborers who mowed their fields, by oppressing the righteous, by trusting in their riches more than they trusted in God, and as we see here in verse 5, living luxurious lives while those who lived around them were suffering and dying. And so we'll see that in this passage. Before we get there, let's go ahead and unmute everybody in the Zoom chat. Does anybody have any questions or comments on the rich and poor passages in the book of James? Zelda, you got anything? Or Ashley or Miss Carol, y'all got anything about the rich and poor passages in James?
Not yet.
All right. We'll keep on keeping on then. I'm going to mute everybody again, just in case there's background noise.
Okay.
All right. So we have, in James 5, verse 1, he introduces this chapter in the similar way that he did verse 13 of James 4. In James 4 and verse 13, he says, "Come now, you who say," and now here we have again in verse 1, showing that there's a connection, I think, between this passage and the passage before it. "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you." Now, if you keep in mind from the previous chapter, that's what he had warned them. He had told them in chapter 1 that their quarrels and their conflicts among them that came from their pleasures, it was destroying them. And he calls them adulteresses and murderers in this section. And as you move on through this passage, he says, "Submit therefore to God, resist the devil, he'll flee from you." James 4:7. "Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded." And then he gives them this warning in verses 9 and 10 that if they don't humble themselves, if they're not miserable and mourn and weep now, then it's implied here that they would be miserable and mourn and weep later because of their double-mindedness and hypocrisy that they were demonstrating through their actions. And so he warns them. He says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you." He is not getting onto them in this passage just because they're rich. There's nothing wrong with having riches, with having money, with having wealth. In fact, that can be a very beneficial thing for God's kingdom. The problem is, in James chapter 5 and verse 1, is that this is those people from the previous section that were not including God in their plans, that were pursuing these riches out of simply selfish ambition, and in doing so, they were oppressing those around them. They're oppressing the poor, oppressing their laborers, and even contributing to the persecution of the righteous. And so this is not like the rich young ruler, where Jesus told him that he needed to sell all that he had and things like that. But this is critiquing these individuals because of how they had acquired and how they had used their riches, not that they had riches. And as you can see that in the previous section in James 4:13 through 17. There's nothing wrong with going to another city and engaging in business and making a profit if you include God in your plans when you're doing that. Okay? Now, in James chapter 5 and verse 2, we read this. He says, "Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten." Now, if you recall, this is something that Jesus had told them in Matthew chapter 6. So if you like, go back in your Bible to Matthew chapter 6, and we'll look at verse 19 through 21. And now we're going to see what Jesus means, or rather what James means, when he's talking about the rich versus the poor in the book of James. We've pointed out this already before. But he says in Matthew 6:19, "Do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now, the way that this passage is constructed in Matthew 6:19 through 21, if we just read the plain English of this, what we read is, "Do not store up any treasures for yourselves at all, but only store up treasures for yourselves in heaven." But the way that this passage is constructed, what he's really saying is, do not only store up for yourselves treasures, but much more store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. The New Testament and the Bible as a whole uses this kind of sentence structure all over the place. It's not to the exclusion of storing up for yourselves treasures on earth, but it's emphasizing storing up for yourselves treasures in heaven. And notice the point of it is found in verse 21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You can have a lot of money in this life, a lot of treasure in this life, and at the same time be poor in this life, because your true treasure isn't here, regardless of how much you have in your bank accounts or whatever, but your true treasure is in heaven. At the same time, you can have very little when it comes to material wealth here on this earth, but because of where your heart lies, right? Because of where your heart lies, you're actually behaving as one of the rich people, right? And so that's what James is talking about in James chapter 5. He's not critiquing people that have material possessions. He's critiquing people that have material possessions and they're using them in the wrong way. Specifically, they're using them to hurt the people around them and to work against the plan of God. And so James uses this saying from the teaching of Jesus in Matthew chapter 6 to basically say, hey, you are in trouble because you have done the very thing that Jesus warned against. You've stored up your treasures here on earth instead of in heaven. Go ahead and unmute everybody again. Does anybody have any comments about that?
No.
It's Ashley. It just made me think about, quantity versus quality, in that, a lot of times people judge their worth or who they are on how much stuff they have, right, instead of, looking at the deeper, do you have what you need? Or the things that are really important provided for?
Yep, that's exactly right. Zelda or Miss Joyce, did y'all have anything?
No, I don't think.
Okay.
No, yeah.
It kind of going off what Ashley said, it reminds me of Philippians chapter 4, which, where Paul says in verse 12, I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. In any and every circumstance, I've learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. And so that passage there teaches us that it's not about how much you have, it's about your attitude towards that wealth. You could have 1 penny and be categorized as the rich people in James chapter 5. It's more about attitude than it is actual possessions. Does anybody else have anything?
Can you hear me?
We can.
Carol?
Hey, Miss Carol.
Oh, hi, how are you?
Doing pretty good.
I have a question. When you said using your material possessions to hurt people, the only thing I knew was that, they were the people they had hired to do their work in their fields, they weren't paying them. What do you think it means using, to hurt people?
Oh, right. What I think about is, someone like Paul, before he was converted in Acts chapter 9, he was using his position of power and of wealth among the Pharisees to acquire those letters, and he put all of his resources in persecuting the church. And, there's people like that in the world today that intentionally support people or entities or television stations or whatever that put out propaganda or to actively work against the work of the church. And so that's the kind of people I think about it, are people who have resources but they use them for evil instead of for good.
Okay. But then that's good. But then back then he's writing to the Jews scattered abroad. That's the only thing I knew, that they weren't paying their workers, I guess. Is that anything else from the first century that you can think?
Oh, right. So, for example, in James chapter 2 and verse 6, we read,
Okay.
You have dishonored the poor man. He says, Is it not the rich who oppress you and personally drag you into court? So
Okay.
they were using their possessions to bring the law down, so to speak, on on these poor individuals that probably couldn't afford a proper defense or couldn't afford to defend themselves at all, and the rich were able to use their riches as a means to help persecute the church and help us try their best to stop the spread of the gospel by employing people like Paul and others to persecute them.
Okay, that's good.
All right, good questions. Anybody else have anything?
Yeah, Daniel, I want to add a comment to that. Like you were saying about people setting their heart on riches of this earth here,
Yes, ma'am.
and things not on riches of above. I was going to use like this rich man. This rich man, he had the money and everything, and knowing he had him a bond, and he was going to build him another bond, so he could store up all his treasures. But he wasn't putting God in the plan. He's just thinking about himself and about what he was going to have, but he left God out. So that's what we should do, always put God in the plan and set our heart on things above, not on the things of this world.
That's a good point. And so an individual who has possessions can hurt others, not just through sins of commission, where they're actively working against them, but also through sins of omission, where they have the means to make a difference in the world, but they choose not to because of selfish reasons, to build up their barns. So that's a good point. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and mute y'all again to cut out the background noise for now, and I'll bring you back. Yes, ma'am.
Hey, let me put this here with that too. But
Go for it.
people, you can't be mad and jealous and envy of everything that another person come across and another person have, because you might not been blessed with it. You don't try to complain against the person that did get something, that gained something. Long as they're using it for the right means and and they did, God blessed them with it. I always look at it, if another brother or sister got a new car and it was the kind of car that I liked it, happy am I, because I might one day have to go and borrow that car.
Yeah. Yep, that's right. So, and that's one of the things that James is trying to cut out of the church. There is cutting out any reason for jealousy or or anger between the members. Any cause of warring between them is what he's trying to eliminate. And so, again, chapter 5, verse 1 is all about attitude. It's not about your material possessions necessarily. It's about how you use them, how you view them, and how you view others because of what you have and what you do with it. And so James chapter 5 again is focused on those who arrogantly seek after their riches and not those who include God in their plans. All right, I see Kyle's joined us, and he'll probably have some words of wisdom before too long. But we'll go ahead and mute everybody, and we'll continue on into verse 3. All right, so verse 3 says, Your gold and your silver have rusted. James 5 and verse 3. And their rust will be a witness against you and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. I want to take a quick break from interpreting this passage, and I want to point out to you another book of the Bible that's very similar in content to the book of James. If you go back to James chapter 2 just for a moment, I need to steal one little passage from there. Or rather, from James chapter 1, not bad. In James chapter 1, he mentions that their riches, if you look at James 1:10, were like flowering grass that would pass away. You see there in James chapter 1, verse 10. The rich man, he says, is like flowering grass that will pass away. And in James 5, he talks about their gold and their silver being rusted. Now, this isn't the only similarity to this other epistle that I want to show you, but it is a pretty major one. In 1 Peter chapter 1, In 1 Peter chapter 1, if you go there and you take a look here at First Peter chapter 1, go take a look at verse 18. You'll notice first off that he says this, knowing that you are not redeemed with perishable things like silver or gold from your feudal way of life inherited from your forefathers, but with the precious blood, as of a lamb unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ. Now if you go down just a little bit to verse 22, he brings up the same idea. He says, since you have in obedience to the truth purified your souls for a sincere love of the brethren, fervently love one another from the heart. For you have been born again, not of seed which is perishable, but imperishable, that is, through the living and enduring word of God. For all flesh is like grass, and all its glory like the flower of grass. The grass withers, the flower falls off, but the word of the Lord endures forever. And this word was preached to you. So if you look at James chapter 1 again and James chapter 5 and compare it to 1 Peter chapter 1, you'll see a pretty strong similarity there in the language that they're using to describe perishable things of the world versus the incorruptible things of God. And so I just wanted to point that out, that there's that similarity and many more between these two epistles. And if you do a study, for example, on the book of James, and you really want to get more in depth than even what we have, it would do you well to pull up 1 Peter as well and compare all that's said. One of the reasons why there's so many similarities between James and 1 Peter is because both James and Peter are writing to the same audience. If you recall, Miss Carol said a moment ago that James was writing to the Jews who are scattered abroad. Not the Gentile Christians, but the Jewish Christians scattered abroad. And the same thing is true for 1 Peter. In 1 Peter, he is writing to individuals who reside as aliens, and he talks about them being scattered through Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and all these other places. And if you look at the contents of 1 Peter, and you ask the question of who is, Peter the apostle to, you'll see that James and Peter are writing to the same folks. They're both writing to individuals who are Jewish Christians who've been scattered abroad due to persecution or whatever. Another strong reason why James and 1 Peter contain a lot of the same themes is because James and Peter were both co-elders at the church at Jerusalem. If you think back to Acts chapter 15 and the council that they had there about whether or not the Gentile brethren should circumcise and follow the law of Moses like the Jewish brethren were doing, you find that both James and Peter were co-elders, and they co-authored a letter that I think is sort of a companion letter to the book of James that went out to all of the Gentile Christians, kind of like James has gone out to all of the Jewish Christians. And so there's a lot of similarities you'll find between James and 1 Peter, and it's because of their common location, their common congregation, and their common audience. They were, again, co-elders at the church at Jerusalem who were both writing to their members who had been scattered abroad due to persecution or travel or whatever else. So in James chapter 5 and verse 3, we read, "Your gold and your silver have rusted, and their rust will be a witness against you, and will consume your flesh like fire." See there in James 5 and verse 3. It is in the last days that you have stored up your treasure. Now that expression, "you will consume your flesh like fire," is pretty interesting. Obviously, the immediate connection that we make to that is to the fire of Gehenna from earlier in the book of James. You'll recall that there's only two people in the Bible that mention Gehenna, and that is Jesus and James. In James chapter 3 and verse 6, we read, "The tongue is fire, the very world of iniquity. The tongue is set among our members as that which defiles the entire body and sets on fire the course of our..." In other words, the tongue, when it's left unchecked, is nothing more than a burning pile of garbage, is the way that you could view that. And so in James chapter 5, whenever he mentions that their rust will be a witness against them and would consume their flesh like fire, he's talking about that their super dependence upon their riches would bring them to judgment. Their super dependence on riches would reveal that they were not children of God like they claimed, but because of their actions, they were actually children of the devil. And what he says to them in verse 3 is quite interesting. He says, "It is in the last days that you've stored up your treasure." Now, this again gives me a pretty big hint that he's not necessarily talking about physical riches here. What he's talking about, it's kind of like you recall Demas, who left Paul because of his love for this current age, talking about the Jewish age. I think what he's saying is, you've put all of your faith into this system. You're rich according to this world, according to this age, and this age is passing away. Why have you gone all in on this age when it's about to go away? You're in the last days of it. So you basically wasted your time or wasted your efforts or whatever. We're going to look at a couple of passages that have to do with that. We're going to take a look at the widow of two mites in a second, and we're also going to look at a passage from 1 Corinthians 7. But until we get to that, does anybody have any comments so far? Kyle, you have any? Oh, Ashley?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, so basically that was kind of like a twofold statement. The fire was kind of speaking literally, but then it was also referring to judgment. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I definitely think that when he says it will consume your flesh like fire, that he's speaking figuratively here. Because, their rust wouldn't actually consume their flesh like fire. But I do think he's saying that it was working against them, that it was basically showing where their allegiance lied.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Kyle, any words of wisdom?
Concerning, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Concerning that thought, she asked whether or not there was a literal element to that fire concept, and there's a rule in hermeneutics, the principles of Bible interpretation, that says that whenever you have a figure of speech, there is a literal idea behind it driving the image. So while he's not referring to literal fire, there was a literal fire in Gehenna that would have flashed in their minds to sell the idea of what he was talking about. So he wasn't speaking literally, but there was a literal fire in Gehenna, obviously, that would have flashed in their minds.
Okay, that makes sense.
Same thing with in the Old Testament when it talks about mountains melting and whatnot. It is a figure of speech referring to the downfall of a nation, but it's the way they sell the image is you get a picture of in your mind of a mountain actually melting to sell the idea of how catastrophic the downfall of the capital of a nation would be.
Mm.
Another idea is, they wouldn't be able to use their riches to bargain with God on the day of judgment. They couldn't say, well, look at all the riches I have. I'm obviously blessed, so why are you, upset with me? That wouldn't work, right? Anybody else have anything before I send you back into the world of the mute?
Carol, I have a question.
Okay, Carol.
It's really basic. When he's talking in verse 1 or whatever, with the 12 tribes scattered abroad, is this letter going to synagogues that have Jews that aren't Christians, or are they all Jewish Christians?
Excellent question. I think that it is going to synagogues of people who may or may not be Christian. It's obviously written to Christians, but I think that the expression "my brethren" throughout the book shows that it's not just written, that it's written to any Jew that would listen to it. And one of the reasons why I believe that is in James chapter 2 and verse 2, he does say, if a man comes into your assembly, and that's the only place in the New Testament where that word is translated assembly. It is the word synagogue. And so I think he's writing to Jewish Christians, but I think that he would want the Jewish unbelievers to read it just as much as the Christians would, and in hopes that it would bring solidarity between the two groups again. So that's my 2 cents.
So you think it was like synagogues that had Jewish Christians?
Yes, it was definitely written to Jewish Christians, but remember the Jewish Christians, they still worshipped at the synagogue. If you look
Right.
at all, so they would have the principles found within the letter of James would have hopefully been passed on to those to the Jewish individuals, and maybe they would come to Christ because of what James wrote. I talked about how in James chapter 2, James places a strong emphasis on keeping the law and not offending the law in one point, which would have been a huge sigh of relief for those individuals that were taught about the church, that they were teaching people to abandon the customs of Moses and to no longer keep the law and things like that. That's what Paul was sort of getting in trouble for by James in Acts chapter 21 before he made the purification offering. And so
Right.
and so
Yeah.
I think it was written primarily to the Jewish Christians, but
Okay.
but knowing that they were in the synagogues with people who weren't Christians.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody have any thoughts on that? All right, I'll mute everybody and we'll move on to James chapter 5 and verse 3. I still want to make a few comments on this passage. So he says here that it is in the last days that you've stored up your treasure. I want to look at two passages in regards to this. The first is 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 29 through verse 31. 1 Corinthians 7 is the passage all about, Paul's answering questions about marriage. And what he says is this in verse 29. But this I say, brethren, the time has been shortened, so that from now on, those who have wives should be as though they had none, and those who weep as though they did not weep, and those who rejoice as though they did not rejoice, and those who buy as though they did not possess, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it, for the form of this world is passing away. In other words, Paul's telling them, it's not wrong to marry, as he says earlier in the chapter, but you have to understand that everything is, everything that we know and have grown accustomed to is about to change. And again, he says in verse 31, for the form of this world is passing away. And so they would need to pay special attention with, where their allegiance lied at this time, because if they continued to put their faith in that world, that cosmos, that old world, then they're going to find themselves in a poor situation, because that whole economy was going to go away. A similar case to this can be found in Luke chapter 21. If you look at Luke chapter 21, Jesus is talking here in the temple, and he points out he sees all the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, but then he sees a widow putting in her 2 small copper coins, or 2 mites. And he said, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them, for they all out of their surplus put into the offering, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on. Now, a lot of preachers use this passage to talk about how wonderful the poor widow was for putting all of her, all that she had to live on into the temple offering. But when you go down in verse 5, he says, and while some of them were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, by the way, funded by people like this poor widow who put in all that they had, right? Jesus says, as for these things which you're looking at, the day will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another which will not be torn down. So what is Jesus saying about what this poor widow has done? She's put all that she has had to live on into this temple when it wasn't even going to be standing in 40 years. He is, I think, complimenting her faith in what she's doing here, the action that she's doing. But at the same time, I think he's condemning the rich in this passage, because he's basically saying these people are putting in out of their surplus. They're making a show out of what they're doing, and this poor widow has been tricked by this whole thing, by all these people to put in all that she has. And so whenever the disciples start talking about how beautiful the temple is, I think Jesus is going in his mind, man, they just do not get it. This widow has been tricked into giving everything that she has into this temple, and it's so beautiful and has all these beautiful stones and things like that, and my disciples think that that's what it's all about, and they don't even understand it. This temple is not even going to be standing in 40 years. I think about it kind of like this. Let's say you have a woman in a congregation, and she's living not even paycheck to paycheck. She can barely even afford that. And you hear the preacher stand up and say that it is God's will for her to tithe. And so she takes 1/10 of what she has and she puts it in the collection plate. And now she doesn't even have money to get all of her groceries that week. Is that God's will? And meanwhile, when you look at the church building, the church building has roof. The roof is 20 feet high. It's got projectors all over the place, to put the sermon up on every wall conceivable inside the building. They have brand new psalm books, brand new carpet, and here the preacher is up there saying, if you don't give 1/10 of what you have, then you're sinning against God. And so now these poor people feel like they have to give 1/10 of what they have, and if they don't, they're guilt tripped into thinking that they're bad Christians and they don't really love God, and they can't even afford to do that. Meanwhile, the preacher is buying himself a new Mercedes. Do you see the problem? That's what's happening here in Luke chapter 21. I'd love to get your thoughts on this. Let me go ahead and unmute everybody, or ask you to unmute yourselves. What do y'all think about that take on the widow with her 2 mites?
I'm glad you brought that up because that is so true. A lot of preachers have really preached that one thing. You're supposed to give to the church. Give till it hurts. Okay. When you ain't got nothing, what can you give? I mean, a lot of people just that way just think that you're supposed to put every penny. Now, please don't get me wrong. I understand that we do supposed to give. But we're supposed to give and do the support of for the church business to be able to go on. I understand that. But some people will look at it and say, you got to do this. You need to take it. Take it from your light bill. They can turn off your lights. If they turn off my lights, then what I'm going to have?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so people have abused this teaching of giving and how good of a thing giving is, but it has been abused. And that's what I think you see in Luke 21. I don't think that we serve a God who would want that widow to give her 2 mites, all of what she had. I just don't see that as God's will there. I think that passage is given as a demonstration of how much they were sold on this idea of a temple. When Stephen stands up in Acts 7 and says, well, God doesn't even dwell in a house made with human hands. So I think it's just I think it's a sad commentary on the pressures of tithing and missing the point of tithing. Tithing was to help. Tithing was in one part to help that poor widow, as James says in James chapter 1. Pure religion undefiled before the Father is this, right? To care for the fatherless and the widows and their affliction, not make them give their last 2 pennies to make to get new carpet in the church building.
Mm-hmm.
So, anybody else?
Well, I thought that's very interesting what you said. I never heard that before.
Mm-hmm.
I had always heard that story of the widow with the 2 mites as a lesson on it doesn't matter how poor you are, you should always give. In fact, when I was when I was like 20 or so, I remember this. If you know me, if y'all know me very well, I like to do magic tricks. So I had all these $2 bills that I had found, and I had stuck them in my wallet. Well, I didn't have anything to give that week. I didn't really have anything in the old bank account to write a check for or anything like that. And so I stuck all those $2 bills in the collection plate because I thought, well, man, this is what God wants me to do. I've got to give something. And even though I don't have much at all, I better give all these $2 bills so I can go to heaven if I were to die on the way home. And I think that just totally misses the point of giving in the first place. Like, what's it even for? It turns it into a work and not an act of love.
I agree.
Hey, Kyle, you got anything?
I'm just thinking about what I'm going to do with my Mercedes.
Consume it on your...
No, I agree with you. What you just said. Anytime a Christian replaces a principle which is taught in Scripture with a ritual, the point
Mm-hmm.
will get lost. You
Mm-hmm.
know.
Yep.
Um,
Even the
and besides,
Sabbath.
it kind of assumes too that our interpretation of what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 16 and in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, that there's some sort of Christian mandate to give on Sundays, ignores what he's actually saying in that context. They were taking up money because Jerusalem was suffering. It wasn't because, God needs our money in order for him to do his thing. So I think it just kind of ties into the whole theme of, it's not the ritual, it's the emotion and drive behind the ritual. If anybody in the congregation is suffering, the other members of the congregation, because of their Christian love, should immediately jump on it and say, we must help this person, they are us.
Yeah.
I think that's the principle that he was intending to teach through the giving to Jerusalem.
Yeah, and the widow with the 2 mites, she shouldn't have been giving her 2 mites. They should have been giving to her. I mean, the temple was already beautiful, and of course they had a duty to support the priesthood, but there's a woman who is suffering and gives all of her money to the temple. It's just totally backwards for God. When you look at God's plan for tithing, as James points out in James chapter 1. Pure religion and undefiled before God is not giving your last 2 mites, but helping those who would be in a position to where if they gave, it would be their last 2 mites. All right. We'll go ahead and mute everybody real quick. And we actually, you know what? We've already been going for about 45 minutes now. We might stop there, and then we'll pick back up in verses 4 through 6, which is good because I don't really like to end at the end of a section in the Bible. I kind of like to end halfway through. That way you see that there's not really a section break. So I'd like to leave a little bit left on the end here, so that way we can continue on to verse 7 without tricking ourselves into thinking that it's a total new discussion, because that's a downfall of section headings, unfortunately. But so does anybody have any final little questions or comments here before we go ahead and close for the day?
I have a question and a comment. I thought that was definitely an interesting view on the widow, and definitely gave me something to think about, because I always just looked at that passage as like, a commendation to the widow that she gave her last. But I totally see where you're coming from. And then my question is regarding giving. I guess I think we have kind of started, we have in a lot of cases running the church like a business. And I guess to an extent I get it, because you have bills coming in, stuff going out. But I just wonder if everybody gets the mindset that, I'll just give whatever, or I'll just, I guess what I'm trying to say is, how do you determine, I know it has to be a personal thing, but what do you do if it gets to a point where you can't cover the things that the church needs? I'm not talking about, big screen TVs and nonsense, but I'm saying just the basic things that need to be run. How do you encourage the members if they're trying to figure out how they should be giving, or I guess, like, what's a guideline, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well,
how you go.
Since we have, this is a problem that the first century church wouldn't have had, right? Because they would have met in buildings and things like that.
Right.
So, since we are facing this reality that, hey, we have light bills, things like that, I think that's why having a budget and having a public, at least among the members, budget, where everybody knows, how much is the light bill each month, what's this, because that way you can gauge, to an extent, what needs to be done, what you need to give.
Right.
And so I think that's, if the church is having financial problems, I don't think that needs to be, hidden like it would in a closed business, but needs to be, addressed before everybody. So.
Okay.
again, that's a problem that we have to answer with wisdom, because there is no biblical precedent for, hey, the water bill is past due and we got to get some money in the collection plate, you know.
Right.
So, and also the idea of a localized preacher, though you do have some of that to an extent. You know, Paul would stay in a place 2 or 3 years at times, and they would support him alongside his secular work, or other churches would support him. You know, you don't really have that idea, and so we have to use wisdom when we're confronted with those situations. And so, if the church budget has a problem, you know, the worst thing you can do is hide it among 3 people. You know, what you would want to do is,
Right.
you know, present that before the congregation and say, hey, here's the problem, let's get this taken care of, you know. Or consider, hey, well, maybe we don't need a building, maybe we need to meet in houses, or, you know, rent a room at the YMCA or something like that, you know.
Okay.
Or a Mercedes.
Yeah. Or you know, get the Mercedes. I need a new truck every 2 years, you know, on top of the.
Oh, boy.
All right. Anybody else got anything?
No, it's great.